This video is going to be an editing breakdown, and just like the name implies, I'm going to break down exactly how I edited that photo and show you guys everything from the Lightroom edit to the Photoshop edit. If you enjoy these editing breakdowns and you learn from them and want to see more of them, then give this video a like right now and comment something in the comment section below. And while you do that, I'll tell you guys about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Adorama, and Adorama is an industry-leading retailer that has been serving photography, videography, and audio customers for almost 50 years now. Their motto is everyone is a creator, and they do their best to unleash that creator within us all by providing us with the tools and expertise necessary to get the job done. I personally shop at Adorama for both the great deals and products I use and recommend, but also the great customer service on those products as well. If you find yourself interested in any product I talk about in today's video, check the links that will be in the description area below and be sure to use those links if you decide to order. What you're seeing on the screen right here is the completely unedited version of that photo of Anna I showed you at the beginning of this video. And I do want to show you guys the Lightroom edit really quickly. That's how it looks like with the Lightroom edit, and I will break that down with you as well as the breakdown of the Photoshop edit. But I do want to explain something. I did actually take this photo underexposed and with the vignetting for a reason. The underexposure was completely, I was getting to the point where I needed to adjust the exposure. This was, I believe, was my first shot. But I did want to explain the vignetting. The vignetting is there because I took that full frame shot with a crop sensor lens. So when you use a crop sensor lens on a full frame, you're supposed to use crop sensor mode, and that kind of literally crops the image so that you don't see the vignetting. And I do want to show you guys a properly exposed photo with the correct amount of flash on the subject, on Anna, with the crop sensor mode enabled. So that's going to be this image here on the screen right here. I do actually like this image, but I did like the other one better for the better expression and pose. But you guys let me know in the comments below if you prefer photo 2, this one, or if you preferred the first image like I did. Try not to pay so much attention to the saturation of the image on the left. It does have a little bit more, but this is photo 1 on the left with photo 2 on the right. Let me know in the comments if you guys prefer photo 1 or photo 2. The very first thing I did to this image was, of course, add a bit more exposure. So I did add 1.55 more exposure because it was very underexposed, of course. And I also felt like the image lacked contrast because the sun was coming into the lens quite a bit. And the way that I brought the contrast back was reducing the blacks to -40. At this point, I did feel like the image could benefit from a little bit more color temperature, a little bit more warmer color temperature specifically. So I did increase the color temperature from 4,750 to 5,000. And then I felt like the image was a little bit too red. So I reduced the tint to 16 instead of 18. Then as I was scrolling down to change the saturation of the image, I felt like it could add a little bit more sharpening. So I went from 40 to 60 on the sharpening. Then I did actually go to the saturation section, the calibration section, and increase the color saturation of the image by increasing the blue primary saturation slider from 0 to 80. This usually does increase the oranges and blues a little too much, so I usually reduce the oranges a bit, but I felt like Anna was so pale that I felt like it gave a good amount of saturation in the image on her skin tone, and then I could just kind of correct the amount of saturation on her face by increasing the exposure. Whenever I increase the exposure on something in Lightroom or Photoshop, I do notice that it does reduce the saturation a little bit. So I knew that I did want to add a little bit of exposure on her face, and by doing that, it would reduce the saturation just the little bit that needs to be reduced on her face. On the screen right here is everything that I did that was just kind of basic adjustments in Lightroom, but then I did a lot of selective adjustments using the adjustment brush tool in Lightroom. So I'm going to show you guys exactly how that looks like. So here's going to be the before the adjustments, and here is how the image looks like after those adjustments, those selective adjustments. But of course, I'm going to show you guys exactly what those adjustments were and why I added them. I'm actually going to work backwards from everything I did in terms of the adjustments and show you guys everything that way, so you guys can see exactly how it looks like at the finished version, and then slowly how I felt like the image should look like after every different adjustment. The last adjustment that I did was actually select just the background because I felt like the background was a little too bright, so I reduced the highlights to -15. So here's going to be without that reduction of highlights on the background. I also felt like her eyes could benefit from a little bit bump in exposure and shadows and contrast and everything that you can see over here. So let me just take off that effect so you guys can see just a little bit of difference in the eye. And everything that's in red here is everything that I did change the shadow level of. So you can see that it's going to be her skirt, her legs, and the boots. I did raise the shadows just a tiny bit to +5. So you might not see it, but it's going to be very, very subtle on those different areas that I selected. The next thing I did was select just her face. So you can see that it's a bit red on her face. That's everything I selected on her face. And then I just went ahead and just brought the exposure up just a tiny bit. So you can see that's the before and this is the after, but let me just delete that again so you guys can see the next thing. So this is going to be deleting that mask, and let me show you the next thing. Everything that's red here was a little bit more exposure. So I did want the subject Anna to glow a little bit. And usually I add a little bit of exposure just on the subject and a tiny bit around the area around the subject. And that's going to be that mask right there. So you can see very big difference there. And then here's the first thing that I did in terms of the selective adjustments. I just selected her and then I reduced the color temperature to -2 +2 because I felt like she was a little bit too warm and a little too green. So I went ahead and tried to fix that with just selecting her and changing those temperature and tint. And then after finally doing all that, you can see this is the end results here in Lightroom. And now I'm going to show you guys what I did in Photoshop. On the screen again is the Lightroom edit only. And let me just show you guys exactly all the different layers that I did in this Photoshop edit. The very first thing I did was using the Generative Fill. I went ahead and removed all the vignetting around her and also removed a lot of different distractions that I felt were too distracting in this image. That's going to be layer 1. So let me show you. This is the before, and it's very dramatic, but here is the after. Before and then the after. One thing I wasn't too sure about was removing all the highlights on the hair, how strong they were before. I felt like maybe just a tiny bit of highlight would work. So maybe it's something that, maybe that's something I'll do again in another re-edit, but I felt like it was too distracting. So I removed all the kind of halo around her hair that was a little bit too strong of a highlight. The next thing I did was did her a favor and reduced all the wrinkles on the boots. And again, that was using the Generative Fill. So I'll show you guys a little bit of a zoomed up version of that. So here is the before, and then here is the after. So again, that was Generative Fill in Photoshop. Then I felt like the top of her head was just a tiny bit too dark on the hair. So I increased the exposure using a curves adjustment layer to just bring up that hair just a tiny bit. So before, after. I also did around a frequency separation to kind of smoothen the jacket just a little bit, the wrinkles in the jacket. So I will zoom in just a little bit right here so you guys can see. Here's the after, here's the before, here's the after. Then at this point, I felt like the face, even though I did a little bit of exposure bump in Lightroom, I felt like it was still a little too dark. And I wanted to kind of just focus that attention back onto her face. So I did a little bit more exposure bump using another curves adjustment layer with this layer here. So this is the after, before, after. I also did one more round of an exposure bump on the legs, on the boots, so you guys can see that in this layer here, before and after. Then at this point, I felt like there was still a lack of contrast throughout this image, so I added some more using a levels adjustment layer. So that's gonna be this layer right here. And of these last layers, one thing I did was remove the distractions. So I felt like all the different things that are on the floor, all those things I felt like were distracting, so I removed them. So that's the before and the after. I then had some fun with the selective color adjustment layer, and I changed the colors to this level right here. And even though they weren't too bad or anything, I wanted to just increase the exposure of the eye bags underneath her eyes to get them, completely fixed. So that's why I did that in another layer. So you guys can see that this is the before and this is the after. Not too severe, but I wanted to just help her out just a tiny bit. And the very last thing I did was a little bit of blemish removal. So this is the before and then the after. And also just removed a little bit of the hair on the eyebrow. And that's pretty much everything I did to this photo to get the end results. So I'll show you guys on the screen right now, the before and then the final edit after. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys learned from it, learned a little bit of the editing that I do. I don't always do this amount of editing to my photos, so this is a very good example of an exception to the editing that I do. I want to say one last thanks to Adorama for sponsoring this video, because when they sponsor my videos, it allows me to keep making free content for you guys, so definitely check them out. Take care guys, and I'll see you in the very next video.